last Kavli Conversation on Science Communication of the semester. My name's Dan Fagan. I'm a professor of journalism, science journalism here at the Carter Institute of Journalism at NYU, which is where you are. And thank you all for joining us online too. If you have a question, here in the audience we have a mic, and if you have a question online, please use Twitter and tweet to Kavli Convo, and we'll hear all about it. I will leave it to Lee to formally introduce our guests, but I'll just say that they're both really smart, deep thinkers about technology and communication and how it's changing the way that we talk about all kinds of things, including science. Kristopher Mims is a person whose work I've admired for a long time and been my friend. Danah Boyd I've never met before, but I really admire her work, and so it's a pleasure to have both of them here. And it's always a pleasure to have Lee Holtz here, Robert Lee Holtz, who is a science journalist at the Wall Street Journal and a distinguished writer in residence here at the Carter Institute. So I will turn it over to Lee, our master of ceremonies, as always.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you very much. And so welcome to the Kavli Conversation on Science Communications. These conversations are sponsored, as many of you know, by the Kavli Foundation and by the NYU Science, Health, Environment, and Reporting Program under the leadership of Dan Fagan, who I really have to, this evening, especially thank for his tireless and creative stewardship of this series. He really makes this happen, and it's not just because he owns the microphones. So this is the fifth and last of our fall series. And as Dan said, as we go, I really want you to consider this not a lecture, but a conversation. So have your questions, help us digress, help us go up interesting blind alleys. But please, whatever you do, use the microphone. And those of you who are watching with us online, you can tweet us our questions using the hashtag KavliConvo. That'll be on the screen periodically to help you along. So look, tonight, we're going to be exploring the revolution of social media in public and private life. I mean, let's admit it, for many of us here and online, the internet really is our real world in many ways. We are drawn like information magpies to the bright, shiny things this technology dangles before us, whether it's a bot that wants to have a political argument or a next cat video. So it is enabling and it is disabling in ways that we are only beginning to appreciate. So here we are together in our bubble, and what a bubble it is. New York, East Coast, academic, bubble within a bubble, journalists, another bubble within a bubble within a bubble. You get the idea. We are isolated within our own networks, within our own worldviews, and one of the things we want to talk about tonight is how social media creates that and also helps us bridge it in other ways. So there we are, entangled. We're in a war for attention. We are complicit. We are victimized. We are entertained, outraged, and uplifted. Stalker parents, credulous technology press, companies scrambling to monetize our social interactions, bots roaming the Twitter sphere, algorithms are in charge, reality is augmented. I mean, is life now entirely a Turing test? It is complicated, and to sort it out, as Dan said, we're joined by two of the smartest technology analysts at the intersection of social media and society, digital anthropologist Danah Boyd and Wall Street Journal technology columnist Kristopher Mims. Now, Danah, for those of you who don't know, is founder and president of Data in Society here in New York. She's a principal researcher at Microsoft Research and a visiting professor here at NYU. Her research centers on questions related to big data, privacy and publicity and civil rights, especially as it concerns issues of inequity and bias. But importantly for our conversation this evening, she spent a decade researching adolescents in their online lives. And in her 2014 book, It's Complicated, The Social Lives of Network Teens, she offers a series of very interesting insights into that ever-shifting world. She's also co-authored 2 other books, Hanging Out, Messing Around and Geeking Out, Kids Living and Learning with New Media, and then most recently, Participatory Culture in a Networked Era. So she is a trustee of the National Museum of the American Indian and a director of Crisis Text Line. And in her free time, and I don't know how she has any, she maintains a website devoted to the lyrics of Ani DeFranco. Chris, my colleague, writes Keywords, which is a well-regarded weekly column on technology at the Wall Street Journal. Before joining the Journal in 2014, he was the lead technology reporter for Quartz, and he's written on science and technology for publications ranging from Technology Review and Smithsonian to Wired, The Atlantic, and Slate. His is a voice that you will have encountered in many corners. He has a degree in neuroscience and behavioral biology from Emory University, which I think is a pairing that's uniquely suited to considerations of the things that we're going to talk about tonight. And his coverage is wide-ranging, from recent columns on the stalling engines of innovation to the effort to perfect a robot that can actually make a perfect cup of espresso. So to begin our conversation this evening, I'd really like to start with us in that critical laboratory of social experiment, adolescence. So I wonder, the statistics that I have seen on adolescent social media are, to me, kind of interesting. 92% of teens go online daily, 1 in 4 are online, quote, almost constantly, unquote. 71% of teens report using more than one social networking site, Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, and so on. And so what I wonder, Danah, if we want to start this off, you have delved into this in some depth, the 8 to 10 years. And what I wonder is what your look at adolescence has taught you about the broader effects of social media.
Right. The scary thing at this point is that it's actually closer to 20, which is terrifying. So I was part of the first generation of young people who grew up online. And for me, it was part of the saving grace. And this is, at the time in the 90s where no one thought it was strange if you used the internet for you to talk to strangers. Of course you were going to talk to strangers. That was the whole point of being online. And it was really interest-driven. And one of the reasons that I started studying what was happening with young people as they were participating online in the early 2000s was I was interested in what would happen as it became peer-driven. It became really driven about, like, I'm going online to hang out with people I already know, because that was a lot of what was happening, and that was a real shift from my own years. And it was a shift that in many ways was dominated for everyone. In fact, the majority of people would come online to communicate with people that they knew in workforce environments and social environments, et cetera. And so I tracked them originally through early stage blogging environments into the rise of social network sites. So from Friendster to MySpace to Facebook to the proliferation of a bazillion different services. And what I kept coming back to was the idea that young people were coming in these environments at a point in time where we had done so much in this country to restrict their ability to just hang out with their friends in any other environment. And there's a great set of historical studies about how much freedom and mobility an average teenager had. My favorite is the British version, which was actually done by the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds. Didn't know there was one of them. And the guy who did the study, who was like so aptly named William Byrd, was interested in seeing 3 generations of mobility. And what he found was that the first generation, the grandparent generation, could basically go as far as they could get a bicycle to get them. The parent generation could go around the neighborhood, and the kid generation couldn't leave sight of the house. And we've seen a very similar dynamic in the United States. The idea of just getting on your bike and being home by dark is pretty much depleted here. And so what we were seeing with young people is it was a place for them to come online, and they knew that they could actually get together with their friends. They could hang out even if they were stuck at home, even if they had different schedules than other people. And we started to see the rise of what I refer to as networked publics, these spaces of public environment that became so powerful. And that gets to your questions, like, how do we understand this more broadly? What we were seeing was the young people who were using this to make sense of their world were engaging in all of the kinds of acts that we would see being normal in publics, from civic engagement to socializing, from flirting and dating to totally messing around and causing trouble. And it was interesting to see it all mixed up. And of course, what would happen is that these tools would become generally used. And one of the things you quickly realize is that they're used at life stages as appropriate and expected for that life stage, which is to say that young people are by and large flirting and casually dating. Once you get into a certain age demographic, depending on the class demographics, it becomes all about finding a marriage or finding a suitable partner or these different forms. Once you get into the elder cohorts, it's all about memory and reminiscing. So there's just these different things that have life stage components to them.
Well, throughout your work in this area, there's this very strong sense that, don't worry about young people. I mean, they understand this. They're digital natives. They know what they're doing. I mean, really back off. I mean, I wonder, Chris, is particularly when we look at sort of recent events and study coming out of Stanford, young people really can't tell fake news from real news. I mean, is it your sense from where you sit that this the generation of digital natives has learned the byways and can track the game and not get lost in the forest of competing status posts? I mean, do you believe this, or you see it as more complicated?
with the major caveat that I don't research this with the level of rigor that you're capable of. As I have started to dig into it, and especially with like Snapchat's IPO coming up, and everyone sort of taking that model very seriously, and just firsthand observation of like young adolescent nieces and nephews that I have, and talking to startups about their metrics and the astonishing number of users that some of them have. I do get the sense that young people have gotten very savvy about keeping their online lives private, and that Snapchat was just the beginning, and now there's all these like live chat apps, and kind of ephemeral communication has become the norm. And so the idea that this privacy is a default, whereas I think honestly like older generations or like our generation got really tripped up by it, because I believe you and I are of the same generation. We're of the generation where we remember what it was like before the internet, and then it happened, and that occasioned an entirely new set of norms. And I even see this big generation gap, and I've written about it, between like millennials as a definition is absurd, because it's like there's so many strata in there, and also like you said, it depends a lot on class. But like younger millennials can be just alien in their habits. I think what it comes down to is like, what's the first app that you open, and that's starting to stratify even by like generations of like 3 and 4 years.
So what I'm hearing from both of you, though, if we could just kind of dig on this for a second, I think there's a public conversation that's gone on about these people don't care about privacy because they've lived their entire lives in public and such. But what I'm hearing from both of you, in fact, that's not true. In fact, what we're seeing here is a talent for finding the private spaces inside technology that's really intended to make everything public.
Part of it is, what do we even mean by privacy? And I don't mean that just rhetorically, but when I started trying to understand how people conceptualize privacy, I realized that for technologists and for lawyers, they very much focus on the control of the flow of information. And indeed, if you think about technical architectures, it's about mechanisms by which you can actually control flow. That's actually not how people conceptualize privacy. Privacy is really about the ability to control a social situation, which is to say, learning to figure out what's going on in that environment, what's in that situation, how do I want to be interpreted, how do I want to be perceived. And that means that you're doing a whole slew of movements across that. You're trying to think about interpretation and context. You're trying to figure out how you can communicate strategically. All of these things that go into figuring out how we navigate privacy. And what happens is that, with young people, they're put in an acute position, because in order to really control a social situation, you need to have agency. And if you've got mom looking over your shoulder, you don't have a lot of agency in a traditional way. And this is one of the reasons why things like Snapchat become so interesting. Because what happens with Snapchat, and increasingly with visual media as a whole, is this moment of being like, you think you understand what that was about? You have no clue, right? It's a way of encoding information.
So you're talking about like what they call social steganography?
Yeah, it's social steganography.
Hiding messages in plain sight.
But also just ways of saying you can have access to the content, but you can't have access to the meaning. And that's a pretty sophisticated way of going about it. The other thing is, technically, Snapchat is not that hard to break. You can keep those images if you want to. But then you violate social norms. And so that's an interesting shift where it's like the technology is saying, everybody's saying, no, you don't keep that around. And you can, but then you're hurting somebody else in a relationship. And that's a really interesting pivot in all of this, which is like, why are we keeping this around? Why do we think that that's important? Why have we set a norm and an expectation that keeping stuff around matters? And that's what makes the Snapchat stuff so interesting. It's not about whether the technology is foolproof, but whether it shifts the norms and the expectations and the way of working around the world.
So Chris, I wonder, you are not a researcher, you're a journalist, you've covered this. That's kind of the idea here, is that we have, each of you from a different side of the digital divide. And I wonder, so what grade would you give social media companies in terms of how they deal with adolescents, with teenagers?
I mean, I think that depends on the social media company. There's actually a great piece today in BuzzFeed by Natasha Tiku, who was at a forum or something with the founder of BuzzFeed talking about how, the founder of Snapchat, talking about how Snapchat enforces various norms, like not just social norms, but like why does Snapchat not have like a fake news problem like Facebook does, for example? And recently I was talking to the head of data at Pinterest, and that company is fascinating under the surface. Like you think like, oh, it's just like collections of stuff that people want to cook or whatever. But like they have this incredibly sophisticated data science team, and they're constantly tuning, and they use a lot of machine learning, and they're constantly tuning their algorithms for specific goals. So one thing that Pinterest does, for example, is they're not just going for engagement the way that Facebook does. Like if they see that you're pinning stuff about food, they actually want to move you toward mastery. So if they see that you're like, oh, I'm learning how to cook an omelet, they're going to like try to gradually step you up until you're like making a mousse or something like this. And I was like, wow, I didn't know you could make algorithms do that. But they're like, we can make them do anything we want. And we're Pinterest, and nobody cares. We don't have a fake news problem. We don't have to answer to anybody. Like we don't have to have a meeting with Glenn Beck about our pins. And so Facebook, I think, really like falls on its face in some ways. Like they're great at like, keeping the really bad stuff from happening and keeping inappropriate content off the site because they have to, because that'd be a PR disaster. But they try to be a neutral arbiter. And there was another great interview today, actually, in the Journal with, I think his name is Jan LeCun. He's head of AI at Facebook. Yeah. And he's like, we have the best AI team in the world, probably, except for possibly Google. And but then he said, he was talking about the fake news problem, and he said, but that's not my department. Like, we have this other division, and they have to decide, like, what essentially our editorial norms are. And so, like, they're in this unique position of being the biggest and the most visible, and so they feel like they need to be the most hands-off. But I think what that ends up accomplishing is it puts the use of their network in the hands of others who are sophisticated about exploiting it. And that's what they're super in denial about.
Do you agree? I see you nodding over there.
I want to drive into what we're talking about with fake news, because I would argue there's three different things that are at play here, and I would actually
with fake news.
Yeah, and I would argue Snapchat has a big fake news problem. It's just not as publicly visible to all of us because we're not actually defining our terms right.
Well, let's define fake news.
Yes, so fake news, as it's being constructed right now in the media, is talking about a handful of specific cases of what it means to be able to textually fact-check something. For example, the idea that Trump was supported by the Pope. And we can argue that's well known to be inaccurate, and that was a headline that got passed around. And part of what's intriguing is the flow of that headline was actually primarily amongst Clinton's supporters who were just aghast that this was being spread around, which made it interesting in and of itself. So it was not actually spread amongst the network that people thought it was. But that's one category of things that are going on. There's two other things that are going on right now that are less visible because in many ways they are a problem with contemporary journalism. The first category of it is by asking questions. Asking questions that actually drive to various moments of doubt, creating false equivalencies.
What do you mean?
So, for example, CNN brought on a leader from the alt-right, a white supremacist group, and put on the banner of it, "Are Jews people?" Right? The very process of asking that question is about seeding a particular form of anti-Semitism within the broader conversation. It is about narrating a particular form of bias and creating a false equivalency that actually suggests that this is a legitimate question to ask. This is not just happening within journalism, it's happening across all of the media enterprises, what we're seeing around this very biased and hate-driven speech. So that's one category. The third category is putting up lists of things that are known to be true to help drive a particular set of beliefs and agendas. So an example of this, if we're going to follow the anti-Semitism direction, is who controls the media? Question mark. A list of people whose names are, who are publishers, who are editors, who are big name on the boards, et cetera, all of whose names are noticeably Jewish. These are things that are flying across media right now. And they're flying across social media. And they're interesting because they're also flying across visual media. They're flying across visual media through juxtapositions and meme magic. The dynamic of putting up
Meme magic?
Meme magic, the idea of flowing things in a particular way to narrate a cultural frame. And so we're seeing a lot more of this, but it's happening in a local networked way. And the reason that this is important, Facebook and Google are getting a lot of attention and a lot of heat for this because their system actually allows things to cross lines outside of those networks. Most of what is actually flying right now that is extremely driven with biased content is not flying across these networks. And that puts us in a really interesting question. Because what does it mean to start combating these things? So things like that process of asking questions, and if you just open up your favorite newspaper, I'll just take the local paper of record, the New York Times, and look at how often the headlines are posing questions that in many ways are meant to frame the story for you. And this is generally, they follow along my particular ideals. Like that's where I'm politically attuned.
Yeah.
But what does it mean when you start to look at it from a critical eye? And for people who are like, oh, this is about doubting. And this is to your point on Stanford, which is that young people, we've spent 20 years telling young people they should be critical of every information that they receive. They should doubt the source. They should question why Wikipedia is happening. They should look and ask hard questions. We've talked about the social construction of knowledge. That is a very academic, progressive-y notion. And then we're surprised that they doubt every information intermediary out there. And guess what? Of course they're not seeing the difference between things that are being described as fake versus real news. Because what is real? And that's not just an existential question. Okay. That is something we've driven in.
So if I'm hearing you, to pull it back in, you are talking about sort of serious, hate speech, propaganda effects, but are those things enhanced or encouraged or driven by the social media technological characteristics, or is this just like, this is stuff that will light on a branch of any tree that's available? I mean, Chris, do you have a sense of, do you feel that there's some technological imperative in here that's somehow exacerbating this problem? We have been hateful since the beginning of time. I mean, let's be real.
That's such a hard question.
Yeah.
And I go
That's
back
why I
and
gave it
forth
to
on
you.
So much. Unfortunately, the more that I cover this, the more it's you're just staring into the abyss, and discerning what the actual truth is a very moment-to-moment operation. It's really hard. Can I kick it to Danah?
No, you can't kick it to Danah. Not yet. So let me rephrase it a little bit then. Okay, so since you're coming at this from the standpoint of a more sort of company-driven vantage, so how responsible are the creators of emerging technologies in this venue
Yeah.
for the effects of their products on society and users. I mean, let's flip it around. So we're hateful. I'm going to say awful things. To what extent are you the startup firm, the next Facebook, the next Google, the next Snapchat? I mean, to what degree is this your problem?
I think that it is, I actually think I have, as of recently, like a fairly extreme view on it, but that I'm prepared to defend. I think it is 100% their responsibility. I think that we have created a situation where, because of the DMCA, this law that
The Digital
Millennium
Copyright Act.
Copyright Act.
There's a provision that protects you if you're simply hosting other people's speech.
Mm-hmm.
I think the point at which you have something as sophisticated as a news feed, filtering what people see, you are a publisher and you are responsible for what people are saying on your site. And that, if taken to its logical extreme, is an unqualified disaster for Facebook and is like ruinous for the business models of most of these companies. But I don't think that's too extreme a position.
How responsible are journalists for the interpretation of what happens of their media?
Well, I think there's a difference between interpretation and like what's stated. Journalists are responsible. That's why we have libel laws, you know.
But you're not responsible for the interpretation of it. So, for example, if, say, the polls are universally inaccurate, and they're put up regularly with little flicker things like this,
Yeah.
and people don't turn out to vote because they think that the election is in the bag?
Yeah. Well, I mean, don't get me started on Nate Silver. So.
I think we already have. No, it's a fair point. So I think that the traditional technology company position is that we're not a content producer. We're simply a pipeline. We don't have our hands on anything. If we're a non-regulated utility, it's not our fault, not our problem. We're a pass-through. Want to make sure I understand your analogy to the journalist. You're saying should the journalist or is the journalist responsible for the impact on a reader, or is the journalist responsible for the content they're producing? Because I think that's what Chris is saying.
Right, and I would say that
Because we are. I mean, for
you're
better or for worse.
responsible for a certain amount of the content, but part of the way that journalists handle this is by asking questions and making things be like, well, maybe it's this way and maybe it's that way, and that's considered acceptable now. But that's where we start to see lines like, "Are Jews people?" as a question that is CNN.
Mm-hmm.
And that is framing a particular set of hate in America right now.
Right.
And I would argue that mainstream media, news media, is not being held accountable for its contributions to a set of harmful speech that we're seeing.
Well, so you're raising kind of an interesting point that's worth talking about, because I do want to keep it framed on the technology, because some things, I'm sad to say, have always been with us, and anti-Semitism is certainly one of them. Powerful companies like Facebook and Google and such are, of course, major distributors of journalistic work. They are increasingly reaping the ad benefits of the online advertising media, much to the horror of more mainstream publishers. And I wonder, as they move in that direction, it does prompt major newsrooms to adjust their strategies. Are you suggesting that our Jews people is a form of clickbait news? Is that what you're saying?
Well, it's CNN, so it's visual. It's more,
Well,
so it's not quite clickbait, but it is, of course, attention-getting. Attention-getting is definitely, in varying forms, has become normative within the media. And there's no, so for me, it is part of the technological. They've become symbiotic, right? If I look at how does Google or Microsoft, when they're thinking about search engines, how do they account for what is considered legitimate? They actually turn to journalists. And they actually rely very heavily on the information that's put out by respected entities. And this is one of the things that Facebook has struggled with at different points, as to what degree do they actually count
one thing
those.
I would push back on that, I mean, Facebook and Pinterest was really going into the mechanics of this with me. They rely on human beings, not journalists, but panels of. Facebook has their regular surveys. A lot of these companies are just regularly having human beings evaluate the output of their algorithms. So I don't know to the extent to which they're relying on journalists so much as they're relying on their audience to tell them what is expected.
What I mean by that, for example, if you look at Google's news offering, right? They have a list of journalistic enterprises that they consider legitimate journalistic enterprises, and they surface them up, right? And they provide a ton of click-through revenue for those entities. The same is happening right now with Apple when you actually flick to the news section on your device. So there's these moments where they're trying to say, okay, we are not in the business of deciding what is news. You guys are, and we're going to turn it over.
But they do, both of those entities, and actually there was a line in that same BuzzFeed article by Natasha Tiku where she had talked to sources who said that Apple had quite a lot of issues with people trying to surface fake news in their news app, which is apparently driving a lot of traffic now. And Apple is making editorial decisions about what goes in it. And yes, they're relying on mainstream journalists, but I guess my point is that there's this additional layer of editorial judgment by them. I mean, the buck stops with Apple, the buck stops with Google, the buck stops with Facebook. If Facebook decides tomorrow that the New York Times is not a legitimate news organization, too bad for them.
But as we've also seen, the New York Times is putting up advertisements that end up actually looking like news stories that turn out to be fake.
Yeah. I don't think that's necessarily
But they didn't need new technology to do that. I mean,
well, they do, because it requires all of the new ad infrastructure. They don't do any editorial curation of their advertisement structures anymore. They actually expect it to be fed to them by third-party entities, which is one of the reasons they don't do checks.
No, I was just saying that advertorials and whatever have been with this for a long time.
Right, but what's happening is it's not actually manually processed anymore.
So I wondered, to what degree, to kind of keep it on the press for a second, but kind of is this arising from certain industries are covered in a skeptical and aggressive way, are kind of held accountable for their actions, and there are those who feel that over the history of the various internet booms and dot-com booms and whatever, that there's a kind of culture of credulity that affects the technology press. Of course, not you, Chris, but and I wonder to what degree you think that aids and abets this. I mean, there just simply is a kind of VC culture of secrecy, a kind of culture of information control that these companies have, but that by and large the technology press, Chris, if I may ask you, has kind of aided and abetted. I mean, people reporters go to events and then are asked to sign non-disclosure agreements, which is a little weird, and a lot of them do it. Have you ever been asked to sign a non-disclosure agreement at interview or a press availability thing?
Yeah, every time you show up at someone's office, of course, they have like a default. It's on an iPad, and you have to. They won't even let you in the building until you sign and swipe and
you sign it?
Thank you.
I have signed it, and then we got like this kind of. This is one of the great things about being in the journal is like we have the luxury of being like thinking really hard about this stuff, but like we will just periodically revise our policies, and like it works because we're the journal, and so we can go in and be like, I'm not going to sign your thing. Like you have to let me in anyway. Like give me a badge by some other means. I don't care if your system will break if I don't, sign on this automated thing. And the same thing with embargoes, and that gets dicey. People get really pissed off about that sometimes, but you have to be ready to make them angry. But then the problem, of course, with making them angry is that there's tons of publications that will just do whatever they want. And so if there's a marketplace of attention, they're not going to talk to me anymore because they're like, forget you, like we can go to some other publication that will be a stenographer for us. I mean, but this happens in politics too. Like when I go and talk to my friends in DC, like their war stories make mine look like, it's like World War III versus the Spanish-American War. That's a terrible analogy, but both terrible wars. But like, so the week that all this stuff is happening and people are like tearing their hair out, it's like Wired is like, is Facebook like the most benevolent thing you've ever heard of in your life? It says, could Facebook save your life? Wired does a lot of great journalism, but it's just the optics of this, like, happening when it did, were just terrible for them.
Well, it's not just a matter of optics. I mean, to linger on this for a second, if we're caught on the one hand between technologies of communication that are evolving so rapidly that you can't keep up with them, and a younger audience, certainly, that's scrambling to find a private space and is moving from app to app. I mean, as their parents discover one, they move to the new one. And a disinclination to, this is, I'm not picking on this person, but I mean, but to pick on the genre. I mean, the sources are always, well-regarded former employees, stockholders, and close personal friends of, the tech titan. I mean, you have three different things. You're triangulating. I mean, what does the public end up with? I mean, where do you get an honest and deep appreciation for the true effects of these social media things?
I think actually that's where we have to rely on academics, people who are truly independent and who still have the ability to just think totally freely and publish whatever you like. I mean,
And
you and I were, one thing I want to make sure we get to, you and I were talking about before we jumped up here, was some of your recent research about what gets spread through these networks, who's doing it, how they're gaming it.
Yeah.
I think if you want to talk about that, like,
talk about
this
some of it.
audience would love to hear about it.
First of all, I was also say, just like journalists, researchers shouldn't sign NDAs either. I never do, and it gets me into so much trouble. It's so much fun. I think that when we think about accountability, we have to think about accountability to whom, for what, right? Those are really important aspects of things. And we keep coming back to the idea of public accountability, and I think journalism for a long time has been a tool to try to hold institutions of power accountable to varying degrees of success in politics and in tech business. I think your point, Lee, that a lot of this has become, just like kudos. I mean, fetishized journalism of like, look what the big tech company is going to do next, means that we're not actually drilling into things. I also think that the reality of looking at these things is so much more complex. The most interesting cases are the cases that the companies themselves don't even know about. So, I think about the moments where researchers have seen and analyzed bias in large systems. So, for example, LaTanya Sweeney, who's a phenomenal researcher at Harvard, a computer scientist, has looked at how, when she searched for her name, she was getting advertisements on Google that would say, criminal justice-related products. They'd be like, was LaTanya arrested? And she was like, so she searched, ran a script, computer scientist, and she was like, searched white baby names and black baby names over a period of time, and found that, of course, it was the black baby names that got the criminal justice-related products. But again, because she's technical, she could dive in deeper. And she's just like, so how is this actually happening? It wasn't that Google was like, let's categorize everybody by names, because that's not how they work, and that's not how their system would work. It was that the public, all of you, were searching. And if you were searching for black individuals, you were more likely to click on criminal justice-related products. So basically, Google was being trained to learn the prejudices of the broader public. So I think that there's moments like that. That's where we start to see accountability, is when we start to try to understand how the system works. But the folks inside it, they immediately were like, oh crap, this wasn't what we designed for. So then we talked to your other point about, like, how does this get gamed? These systems are gamed. They're always gamed, and technical systems and social systems. We can think about search engine optimization as a gaming of large-scale technical systems. But part of what's at stake right now is that we're actually seeing the gaming of a whole slew of our infrastructure. I grew up in hacker culture, and in our generation, that meant we hacked into the security infrastructure just to prove that we could, right? We're smarter than the Navy. Ha ha, that's really funny. And then in the mid-2000s, it became about trying to game the media. There was a particular network of folks. If you don't know what 4chan is, read the Wikipedia entry. Don't go any further. Which thought it would be really funny to get journalists to say stupid things. So my favorite was at the time when MySpace was really cool and everybody was obsessed with pedophiles as the biggest threat to young people. A bunch of 4chan teenagers thought that this was ridiculous, so they decided to divert Oprah Winfrey and get her to spend a half an hour on air talking how that pedophiles had organized themselves online through a teddy bear named Pedo Bear, and that you could find all of the pedophiles online through this teddy bear. And she spent a half an hour on this. Time magazine put out a list of people, 100 most important people in the media, in the public, and 4chan decided that they were going to play with this. And Time magazine arrogantly said, "You guys are dumb teenagers, you don't know what you're talking about, we can see you gaming." And they printed their list. And down the first letter of every name in that list, it said Marble Cake, also the game, which was a total in-joke with regard, again, don't look that one up, but it was a total in-joke with regard to 4chan, and it was gaming the media. The reason I bring this up is it comes back to where we are right now. There are a lot of games playing right now to try to get the media to cover certain stories, to cover certain frames, to really think about how to bias things. And they're using technology. They're planting things all across the internet, knowing that the journalists will go and think that these are sources. And we're watching time and time again as people are actually picking this stuff up. And this is where I think that there's another interesting challenge, because journalists are incentivized at this point to try to pick up stories as fast as possible and to feed it and to legitimize it. And what are we seeing happening? And I'm struggling with a lot of what we're seeing because it's not necessarily pretty or plays into the direction that we would like it to go.
Do you feel surrounded by traps?
Do I feel surrounded by traps?
Well, other than Dana and I.
Yeah, I'm in a vice-like grip at the moment. In some ways, like maybe kind of, I don't want to say rhetorical traps, but traps. The thing that the media does now faster than ever is settles on like a narrative and a counter narrative, and then, oh, here's this other narrative that's orthogonal to it. And I think part of that, I mean, it's this weird kind of feedback loop, and it's very meta, where part of that is because of the dynamics of social media and what gets shared. It's like there's the story, and that's going to get so many shares if you can get it within a particular window of time. And then there's the take, and that's going to get so many shares. And I've seen this because I used to be at courts, and we all would like stare at our live chart beat dashboards like all day long, and it like drove us crazy. And then, you know, then there's the counterintuitive take, and there's a window when that will work. And if you're 2 weeks behind a story, then you better have something really crazy. So like there are these kind of rhetorical games that you end up playing where I don't think that it's like the truth, but it's like this Borgesian like library of all possible takes, and you're playing the lottery of like, oh, which one of these is going to go viral? And if I turn out enough this week, then one will work. And I can say that because I've worked at like, you know, I really started in like the kind of like shoveling coal part of journalism, and in the early days of like, you know, where you'd get paid by the click, you know, blogging and stuff. So I've done that, and then now I have really the luxury of not doing that. So.
Did you ever buy bots?
No, I don't know what that would be.
Yeah, explain.
No.
Then we have a question I want to get to. Please.
One of the things that's happening is that you can, if you actually go and look at who's being followed on, say, Twitter, or who's actually clicking on things, increasingly there are bots, robots, automated systems, and you can buy them. Journalists are actually keep getting caught buying them because they get paid per click, and you could actually, $5, 5,000 bots that will actually click on everything you ever post. And it's again these weird symbiotic things where it's like once you create an incentive and you think that it's accountability because you're getting views, you end up with these games.
I think we're even beyond that though, where if you put you know, a smart young writer in what is like a Skinner box, it's just like this total feedback of like, you know, here's your you know, your chart beat or your metrics thing, and then here's your ability to publish with limited oversight. Like, we're all, like, our brains are just statistical filters. Like, you very quickly start to learn, like, what creates the most engagement, and it's pretty universal, and it's also unchanging, even as or like what was really popular on Dig back in the day before Facebook even was available outside of college students is the same stuff that does really well on Facebook and Twitter and other places today. Like, it doesn't change. And also, by the way, it's the same kind of sensationalism that did well in the early days of newspapers.
Sure.
Like, I think it's just like human psychology.
Yeah. I want to just ask a follow-up question, and then if you would just be patient for a second, I thank you. So we're talking here about, okay, so the companies have got their blinders and their self-interest, and journalists have got their. I'm curious now. I was very struck by an example that you offered in your 2014 book on the adolescence, where you talked about the sort of the sociological and racial dynamics of membership in Facebook versus MySpace, and that was all very interesting. But you mentioned in passing this thing that the New York Times was writing stories about how MySpace was dead at a time when, in fact, MySpace had just as many members as Facebook. Correct. But the fact was that the journalists didn't belong to MySpace. They had Facebook blinders. So I'm wondering from both of you whether you feel there's a factor here that's operating where, part of what's warping this is sort of the journalists' own social media habits.
I mean, I think one of the places we've seen it is what's happening with Twitter. Twitter's
That's
organizationally and structurally a mess right now, right? It's terrible. But every journalist out there relies on it heavily.
Journalists love Twitter.
Journalists love Twitter. And in some ways, like, I mean, as somebody who personally loves loves Twitter, I'm kind of thankful because the journalists have kept it alive. It's kind of great, their obsession with it. But it's sort of interesting because they even created a false equivalency between Facebook and Twitter, long ago, because they relied on it so heavily. So I mean, I think we see that over and over again. Like, journalists can actually make a tech company. They can make and break a tech company. And I think that that's often underestimated. And this goes back to, like, one of the reasons why they get so obsessed with, like, wanting you to cover it in a very particular way, because it really does make a difference.
It does make a difference, but I got to say that, like, we don't have, I think PR people especially, like, overestimate how much influence we have. Like, you can bring attention to something, but, like, there is a little bit of, I think, a sort of selection bias, or survivorship bias, hindsight bias in looking at it that way, because, journalists hype all kinds of stuff that fails. And but, I mean, you're right about Twitter, though.
It's about critical time periods.
Yeah.
Right? Like, there's pivots where it's like the journalistic coverage can actually make a huge difference.
And Snapchat's doing a great job with that now, with those very selective drops of their spectacles. I mean, like, how many pairs of Snapchat spectacles are there? And I say this as somebody who's wearing them in my Twitter profile, so it's like the ultimate hypocrisy to even savage them. But yeah, they played me like a fiddle.
They did play you like a fiddle.
Yeah.
Yeah. So let's pivot. Sir, thank you for your patience.
Yeah, of course. So I had a question. It was around like the cost-benefit analysis of, like, actually trying to tackle a fake news problem. Like, how impactful is it? I mean, it's a really hard question, and something that's really difficult to measure. I mean, I listened to, like, 538 and different podcasts, and no one's saying that fake news caused the election a result that happened. And I don't think that it would be difficult. Sorry, I don't think that we should go that far. But, like, just measuring the impact of fake news on real events, like, how significant is that? How much of a problem is it? Like, can you quantify that impact? And then for tech companies, they always run, like, cost-benefit analysis to figure out if they want to invest in developing those solutions. So for a tech company, that's the question that they're going to be asking themselves. Is it in our best interest to actually invest in like an ML algo that can sniff out fake news, or some sort of bespoke rules that can filter this stuff out? Like, so I'm just wondering from you guys, like, for the pure impact perspective, like, how can we quantify that?
So I think I'm hearing two questions. The first one is kind of, is there a real impact of fake news? And
how do we quantify? Sure, fine.
Yeah, and then the second question has to do with what's the interest of a company in dealing with it or building an algorithm to sniff it out? So.
Not just the company, but like for citizens too, right? We want to.
Right, I understand. I'm just trying to boil it down to something I can beat these two over the head with. So, let me start with you. So, we call it fake news this week. Last week we'd have called it propaganda. Before that we'd have called it lies. I mean, we're all exercised about it, and we're all kind of cranky with Facebook and Twitter's trending news problem. Do you really feel it has an influence? Do you really feel it has an effect?
I mean, I think the jury's out on that. Like, I think that the speed with which the media seized on it spoke to me more of just this kind of visceral need to seize on something. And so I could be wrong, but I think 5 to 10 years from now, we'll be thinking of fake news very differently than we do. It's just like very of the moment. And I find the idea and its impact still kind of suspect, but I like what you're saying, where you're like, part of the problem here is definitional, and what we really need to be talking about is like how net do our means of communication distort the truth and undermine our democracy.
From my perspective, I actually agree with Chris. I think that the media needed to jump on it because they needed to have something. I also think because they couldn't actually go through a reflexive process of their own participation in what was going on with the election, so it was easier to talk about something else. I think that the very process of measuring it, in some ways, is like, at best we'll get correlative, but we don't even know. There's so many other factors at play. I don't think we're going to actually create meaningful measures, although we're going to have a couple of new experimental options. We're already seeing the same thing starting to unfold in terms of efforts to get people questioning things in a problematic way for the French election. So I think that the French election will be an interesting test for a lot of things. I think, and I will say, I think that the companies, and they're all trying to struggle with what they're going to do about it all. So there's going to be some interesting innovations and interventions coming out about it. I think that the interesting thing for me about Facebook in particular is back in the spring, they got accused for removing conservative news.
Yeah.
And many people don't actually look below the headline to understand what they were talking about there. They had hired a slew of people, third-party vendors, to try to weed out things that were, in effect, fake news. True conspiracy and propaganda content, most of which turned out to be conservative. And so when they removed it all, they got attacked by the media for how dare they censor. And they made a decision at that time that they would sort of back their hands away from any curatorial move whatsoever and say, fine, it's up to you and what you share within your own network. And now they're getting slammed in the other direction again, which is sort of a fascinating move, because we're also not even sure that we know how to list it. And this goes back to your question of
know how to listen?
How to understand which content is considered to be fake or problematic or within bounds. So the reason, like it was mentioned, can we use a machine learning algorithm to seed it out? We don't know what content we're even talking about half the time. And what's challenge is that when we were doing it, when Facebook was doing it manually, the stuff that they were pulling out actually turned out to be pretty high quality crap. But they removed it and they got attacked for that as a form of censorship. So what is who gets to define what kinds of crap they should remove? And I don't, even as we're talking about it, I don't think that everyone in this room would actually agree on which content should be removed and which content shouldn't. And I think that's where we're in a really interesting conundrum, because even if we wanted them to do something, so the reason why you do automation is because you figured out how to define something and you want to now do it at scale. We got to start by defining it. And if we can't even agree on which content should be excised, classic example, should Breitbart be excised? Like, reasonable people will violently disagree on that one, right? About whether or not it is a legitimate news source, whether or not they should have a certain kind of protection of press, whether or not that kind of speech should be censored at all. Like, these are battlegrounds of classic American governance and democracy. And if we can't figure that out ourselves, how do we expect them to automate and scale it?
Please.
Hi, I actually started kind of getting into my question a little bit. But there was a little bit of, obviously, tension here on the idea that different platforms should be the ones to monitor this and to have a say on what appears. But then also the issue of journalists in their content, or even just in the titles of their content, their headlines, insinuating a kind of a storyline. And if you're saying that these media outlets are supposed to look to journalists as their sense of moral compass for this, and that means, shouldn't the journalists be the first compasses to begin with? Shouldn't they have the right to insinuate those things? Though obviously the CNN headline is an extreme version of this, or maybe not so extreme. The point is that there are lesser ways to do it, right? Or is that not allowed? Or are you supposed to draw a line somewhere there? And then even then, it becomes a question of what then is important enough for you to be able to get away with an insinuation or not. So could you address that a little bit? Because there's 25 soon-to-be journalists here, and I think
no, it's a good.
they might be confused like me.
I feel obliged to toss this one to Chris and then back to you.
Yeah, please.
And
Yeah. Oh, I thought you were going to expand on it. All right.
no, that was the pregnant pause.
Yeah, I gotcha. So I think that like the very direct answer to your question is that you can only maybe learn that through experience, if I understood your question correctly, and that you do have to listen to your readers. And maybe a really unfortunate thing that has happened in the media is, and maybe it's just the pollution of comment sections or whatever, or the death of the letter to the editor. Like, I feel like that the terrible irony in some ways is that like the media has become like more one way as time wears on, and certainly like when I compare it to the days of like the early internet, like one of the things that I loved is I felt like there was this real dialogue with readers happening, and that's still one of the reasons, as you observe, journalists are obsessed with Twitter, is like it's one of the few places you can still get that kind of productive, immediate feedback. Although I also feel like a lot of intelligent people who are not journalists have been sort of chased off Twitter, so it's just turning into another disastrous comment section. So like there's some, I think we've really missed an opportunity in creating all this technology to like have these very civil, like two-way channels, so that like if you write a headline that's a question mark, you know immediately whether people have misconstrued it or like you're having some impact that you didn't intend, because it's so contingent. It's not like all question headlines are bad or all insinuations are not justified. It's actually really that what happens in my experience is you'll get into a topic area, you'll think you know what you're talking about, you'll kind of assert it with a lot of good evidence, and then someone will be like, yeah, actually, like you've been played, and here's this whole other dimension you didn't know about, and you're like, oh wow, like if I'm going to be responsible in covering this, like I need to incorporate that into my next round of coverage.
You have a thought?
So both journalism and anthropology have sordid histories, right?
Oh, that's for sure.
Places in time where you're just like, they thought that was a good idea, really? And I think I'm in some ways we're picking on journalism because of the context of this conversation right now, but, I think it's important to realize that going back into these histories is really important to realize why these things are unresolved, right? Yellow journalism has a long particular set of moments in time where everybody's like, ooh, yeah, that wasn't pretty. There's questions of selling out. There's questions of having media being controlled. The same is true in anthropology and in many other fields that some of you are part of. And I say this because there's no right answer to your question. There's no way to fully understand how to work this through. One of the challenges for those of you who are students in this room is that this is a lifelong battle of what does it mean to be ethical in your practice, in your research, in your journalism. And I think that that's something that is constantly, with each new set of technologies, has to be reworked out in new ways. And also, let me give a moment of really sort of interesting, shining happiness for me in ethics and journalism, because I think we're picking on it, but there's not these moments of like where the field came together and went, oh, one of my favorites is how journalists would cover people who died by suicide. There was a realization that the headlines, when you covered suicide suicides headlines in the top paragraphs would result in large numbers of copycat suicides. And journalists went, shit, we did that? That is not good. And so there was a very intentional decision on the part of a whole slew of journalists to say, we need to strike that from a norm within our practice. And indeed, to this day, many journalists, when they cover somebody who dies by suicide, if there's a reference to suicide at all, it's buried way, way down. And if anything, there's another story that's about challenges of suicide and depression and how you should respond to it. And they've done a really good job of thinking of ethical standards. The question comes into play on all of this. How do we start defining the ethics for a contemporary ecosystem? What changes? What stays the same? How can we learn from our historical lessons? And for many of you who are engaging in journalism as a practice, we need you. We need you to help define this, right? Like, that's part of this process. It's not going to be solved for you, and it's not going to be easy. And I think the reality is that all of us are struggling with how to do these things well.
I have a question from Twitter. What, if anything, should be the response to tech that lets malevolent people shape media and public discourse?
Chris?
What should be the response to tech that lets people shape public discourse? I mean, that sounds like that's kind of the question that you were just alluding to, which is just that we're in the same position we're always in when it comes to like freedom of speech. Like, you invent movable type, and suddenly you can disseminate propaganda, and you can also overthrow unjust governments. Like, I don't know that I know of a technology that is uniquely suited to malicious intent when it comes to distributing information. So that's hard. I mean, whatever we attempt to ban has consequences, and I would rather have faith in our ability to establish new norms and continue to modify the technologies we have.
Malevolent actors are amazingly creative.
Yeah.
Amanda Lenhart from Data and Society just put out a beautiful set of research on harassment on the internet.
I was going to ask you about that. Yeah.
And it's a national survey of looking at how people are experiencing and understanding harassment online. And in many ways, it's heartbreaking. It's not surprising, but it's heartbreaking because we have seen a radical increase in harassment. And if I remember the stats right, 72% of people had witnessed harassment, and 48% had personally experienced it. And that, not surprisingly, those who are experiencing it and those who are witnessing are more likely to be marginalized populations. The reason that this becomes important is that this is a tool that we thought would be democratizing. We thought would be making it available for everybody. And we're seeing some people have far more negative experiences than others. And what's heartbreaking about it is that she also found that those who have had these harassing experiences and those who have witnessed it are more likely to self-censor. And so even as we live in an environment where we imagine this to be an opportunity for speech, we see this kind of censorship. And this goes back to your point on Twitter, which is we see people opting out because they're getting doxxed, because they're getting swatted. Journalists who are getting attacked for trying to speak about feminist issues or speak about certain topics that are seen as politically fraught. And it's challenging because I've watched, a lot of these companies, they go and try to ban users, and they pop back up in new forms, or they go onto a new service and they find new ways of attacking. And we think that we can solve it by just trying to look at the technological layer to the communication. But what does it take to start to get to the roots of this? How do we get beyond this and realize that this problem, to Lee's point, is one that's long-standing, and technology has mirrored and magnified. Because what technology does better than anything else is it mirrors and magnifies the good, bad, and ugly. And I think that's where you'll see this challenge, depending on where you sit. You're going to be angry at technology because it's mirrored and magnified the ugly, or you're going to be hopeful about technology because you've also seen it mirror and magnify the beautiful. And that's what's tricky, because all of that is simultaneously true. And so how do we then move forward to construct a society that we feel like we can respectfully live within? And I think that that's one of the reasons why we're all struggling trying to figure these things out, because there's not a clear path pathway forward.
Okay, so of course, and I'm going to throw this to you, Chris. One of the suggestions about how we deal with this, and I should say it's important to remember that when the internet first came on the scene, I mean before the web even, this was going to be the great tool for democratization and uplift and the bright future of humankind. We were finally all going to be better people simply because we had email addresses and we were on the internet. I mean, it's really important to remember that. So it's quite a fall from grace. And one of the well, I'd imagined.
It's a fall from hype.
Well, yeah, that too. No, but there was a special feeling, I recall, a feeling of inclusion, of being part of something very special.
It's true.
But let me ask you, so one of the solutions that's often these days posed to the problem of social technology magnifying all the things about human nature that we'd rather not confront in our feed, is to, well, let's construct algorithms that can police the social space for us, that, well, we can code for hate speech and we can code for this, and these things can all react fast enough to smother the unpleasantness that is human nature. What's the role of algorithms in public space like that? What's your view?
Well, on a very simple level, when we think of algorithms not as something that are necessarily like a filter on top of all these social networks we're familiar with, but with the social networks themselves and their dynamics, like they can have a tremendous role. Like that's the caveat to what I said before. Like, I mean, if you look at an app like Secret, which was shut down by its creators because I think they felt like it wasn't really being used in a very helpful way, or I don't know what's happening with Yik Yak anymore, but like that was just there. It's very clear that there can be extremely bad intersections between certain human tendencies, like what are you willing to say when you're totally anonymous in a consequence-free environment, and how does that impact other people? It turns out those are technologies we don't want to build, and that's true throughout history. Like we have conventions that ban chemical weapons. So I guess I'm comparing Yik Yak to like sarin gas or something. But the point is, like, we decide that these are things we're just not going to do because they violate our norms. And then, but to the extent of like how do like algorithms operate as like independent actors that like filter what we see and hear, I think the fact is that like they just do have a tremendous role, and we can't escape it. And they do filter what we see. The important thing to remember maybe is that like we are just as much a part of those algorithms. Like, not to be overly like reductive about human behavior, but like the way that we behave in aggregate can be fairly predictable. And so we can't just say like, well, it's Facebook's fault for doing this. We have to say, it's also our fault for all reacting in this way, and maybe if we stop doing that, it wouldn't work. Like, so I think that we do have to have a certain responsibility and say, I'm going to be a conscientious objector to, this kind of media or this kind of participation. I mean, as journalists, like, you have more of an opportunity to do that, but individuals make the decision every day.
I know that you've been looking a lot at the sort of biases that are kind of intentionally or unintentionally encoded into the algorithms that are supposed to save us from ourselves.
Well, keep in mind, an algorithm is nothing except a set of instructions to a computer. Somebody has to construct those instructions, a set of rules. And the blessing and curse of a computational system is that they are designed to follow those rules. And the question is, who's writing those rules? Who's checking whether or not those rules operate in the way that they were intended? So let's compare it to another set of rules in the more social space, the rule of law. Right? The rule of law is a very complex process by which we try to define the rules of this world. And we have judges or judicial decision-making in a whole variety of ways to try to operationalize the rule of law. We also use discretion all over the place. My guess is that many of you have jaywalked within the last 48 hours. This is New York, after all, right?
Yeah, really.
Imagine a situation where every time you jaywalked, you got a $10 fine, right? That would be what it would look like to have this done in a computational structure. You'd be outraged, and you'd be fighting the city over the ridiculousness of this, and why do we have these jaywalking laws to begin with, and yada, yada, yada. So what's at stake with the rule of law, like what is at stake with an algorithm, is who gets to define it, how much discretion is built into that system, and then what happens when you start to do it at scale. And I think about this because what's happened is that we have biases that bake into any system of structure the moment that we enable discretion or the moment that we actually have to automate something with a particular set of constraints. We have biases in every implementation of our laws. We have biases in the way in which humans interact with each other in society. We should not be surprised that we also have biases within any of our automated systems. The question then is, which ones do we combat, and how do we go about the process of trying to combat that? And that's where we are stuck in a governance problem. And it's funny because we keep being like, algorithms, they'll fix it. And it's just like, who thought that was a good idea? Because we haven't even figured out how to define the terms in which they should operate. And once we actually do, you realize how hard it is. And this is the thing that I think is so amazing. And for those who are students, please take a computer science class while you're here at NYU. Learn how to design one of these systems, and you realize how bloody difficult it is. It is not easy to define these terms in a way that we can actually find socially acceptable. And I think that's important because as we're going to turn to them, just like we've turned to the rule of law, we're going to make mistakes and we're going to have massive problems down the line. So how then do we think about the broader accountability structures?
You, sir, please. Thank you for your patience.
I was really struck by in the discussion of fake news, how it always reverts back to content, to how this is just a terrible thing to see on CNN, or this is a ridiculous claim, or the Pope didn't actually do that. It's about the problem with the content. And I just wonder, since this is a journalism school, if we could talk about fake news in terms of process, about what does not adhere to the ethical and procedural standards of good journalism. If a story is simply made up, whether you like it or not, it's fake news. Whether it comes from Apple or from Breitbart, it's fake news. And contrarily, if the story has been actually reported, then you have to say it's not fake news, even if you hate what it's telling you. I mean, it seems to me that that might be a sort of a standard that we could talk about to sort of eliminate this idea that it's an ideological problem. And I mean, it seems to me that's part of our obligation as journalists is to think about the process by which these things are produced, rather than, gee, do I like that? Does that make me feel warm and fuzzy? I mean, I just wonder if anyone has any thoughts on that.
I think part of it is also who's the boundary of setting what is defining of news. I mean, Chris has a long history in blogging, and blogging was a whole collection of different actors with a whole set of different incentives and goals, self-included. Where I was never thinking of myself as a journalist, even while I was using the exact same platforms he was using. And I think that that's an interesting moment. And so, I think about, for example, one of the cases that the New York Times covered of an individual who took a picture in Austin, Texas, of a set of buses outside, and was like, "Oh, I think the Clinton campaign is shipping in protesters," and that then got picked up across a whole slew of folks, some of which weren't even journalists, some of which were not journalistic enterprises, but that's where we saw a spread, and that became news. And so, part of the things I would throw back to Chris is blogging has had a long time of trying to battle out what was amateur and what was, journalistic practice, which a lot of ethics is about that. How do you think that conversation has matured or gotten complicated over the last 15 years as this whole thing has sort of blown up?
I mean, I think the important thing to remember, and it took me so many years to realize this, I never understood, where all of because you really get it's like journalistic ethics. It goes so deep. It's the rules of baseball or something. You think it's just don't, tell the truth, don't take a bribe, whatever. But there's so many edge cases, and you don't necessarily, and I see organizations do this all the time, news startups, individual bloggers, etc. stumble into an edge case, it blows up in their face, everybody savages them, and then it's like, okay, class, like here's a reminder why we don't do this specific tiny little thing. And so I think like what Facebook and Apple and all these other companies are going to eventually realize is that the ethics that we apply to our attempt to preserve civilization by telling the truth to as many people as possible, like exist for a reason. There's nothing arbitrary about it. And you know, the moment that you start speaking to an audience, you are of the media, and maybe you don't accept your responsibility for what you do, but you're going to have an impact, and there will be, hopefully there are consequences if you mess it up, and you'll have to contend with them. So I think that there is this evolutionary process that happens.
So you see me as of the media because I keep a blog?
Yeah. And I mean, that doesn't, but there are tons of bloggers who don't have to like deal with or think about all these things because what they're doing is going to have like a limited impact. But like if you're somebody who styles him or herself as a journalist, like James O'Keefe, who's doing this like gotcha journalism, he recently kind of like, he gets people fired all the time and causes a lot of controversy, but then he also kind of gets nailed for a lot of his less savory practices. And that's just part of the sort of natural evolutionary process.
So we get disciplined, okay? If
We get disciplined by our readers.
Right, no, well, we get disciplined by readers, but we also get disciplined by our employer if we transgress. I mean,
Right.
we get fired, we don't, you know.
Talk to.
That too, yes. But I'm curious now, I want to back up. So you don't consider yourself in the media, of the media, for the media?
No, I
Do you
consider
consider
myself
yourself a source? I mean, what's your
I'm definitely
what's
a
your
source.
stance?
I'm
What's
definitely
your
a source of
stance?
different types. I made my blog, you know, in 1997,
Right.
and I, you know, it was on a Unix machine, so I know the size of my audience, 3. I had 3 readers. I knew them all, and I was dating one of them. So, you know, it was, and it connected to those Ani DeFranco lyrics. And at some point I decided I was not going to look because I was feeling really upset when the person I was dating was not looking at what my blog. I felt really bad. So I decided to stop looking. And then, you know, somehow along the lines, I acquired an audience. And to this day, I actually have no idea how many people read my blog. And it makes me feel better that way. Twitter has forced a number on me that I have to grapple with. And I find, for me, it's a practice. And it's a practice that I have my own ethical standards, but I certainly don't know the journalistic ethics standards.
But have you ever been in a situation where you characterized something in a particular way, or you said something, and there was enough blowback that you said, next time I'm going to handle that differently?
Oh, absolutely. I mean,
But that, I think, is the natural evolution of journalistic standards.
Yeah, see
but
here.
that's
they're
the
getting-
natural evolution of research,
We got 2 different sets
True,
of
and I think
norms
that
here,
they're linked. Yeah.
if I can use that word. So we have a set of journalistic, whatever you want to call them, ethics, norms, guidelines, like, you know, in the pirate movie, rules. And, you know, they're ensconced in the Constitution, and some of them are just trial and error. Now, you're coming to this table, you're a scientist, you're a social scientist, you're a digital anthropologist, you're whatever. So you have a set of norms as a scientist.
Absolutely.
Absolutely, right. And you get beaten around the head and shoulders if you
All the time.
transgress those, yeah. But when you put on your blogging hat, or when you put on your, I'm going to be an analyst and create a raw material for media coverage, which you do routinely with Data and Society, I mean, what does that make you? And who holds you accountable?
So that's a very good question. You know, I'm a hybrid. I made a decision very early on. In fact, when I was finishing up my PhD, and you know, there's a traditional academic pathway, I was told in no uncertain terms from many people that because of my blog, I was unhireable in academia. And that if I wanted to get a professorship, I needed to shut up fast. And I decided I didn't want to take that path. And I found that the process of producing content and having those conversations in public. Being a public intellectual was
Mhm.
allowing me to go deeper and further as a researcher than I was willing to engage with the academic processes in politics. And in terms of holding me accountable, do I mess up? And just like Chris, oh boy, do readers call me on things, right? And I love, when I was doing the teen work, I'd get these amazing letters from teenagers being like, you're wrong, here's all the reasons why. And I was like, I love you. I was like, this is great. And I mean, it would be iterative, and that was the learning process. But also over my career, I had a frontline journalist trying to prove that I was falsifying research, because it seemed to be too in favor of a particular entity. I've had to, deal with, misinterpretations of my research, often by journalists. One of my favorite ones that I got in trouble with was trying to explain a very famous sociologist, Irving Goffman. Like any sociologist knows who Irving Goffman is. Trying to explain some of his basic theories to a journalist, who then published them as they were my theories. That went over really well. That got me into massive academic trouble. So I mean, part of it is I struggle with this and your question, because it's like it's all wrapped up in messy. And the best that I've been able to do is to figure out what is my internal compass, how do I drive forward, and how do I ask the people that I respect and believe to challenge me and to push back at me. And I don't have the institutional structure that you two have that get me fired for this. It's more a matter of, I believe in the production of knowledge and the critical processes of what scholarship should look like, and I want to be held accountable to produce better knowledge. And it's one of the reasons that I do believe in a certain kind of peer review. I no longer, peer review my blog posts, but I actually send them out often to be like, what have I got wrong, right? So there's interesting ways in which I try to build the accountability structures, but I think that part of the challenge of being a hybrid is that we don't necessarily live in the structures that you're talking about, and this is where I think that those ethical challenges become more difficult for people who aren't necessarily in institutions.
Well, I mean, it's an interest because increasingly, I'm sad to say, there are more of you than there are of us. We have a question here.
Hi. Excuse me. I wanted to talk a little bit about the idea of accountability and whether or not either of you think about surveillance, because there's this idea, if you don't have anything to hide, then what are you worried about, right? And I'm wondering what happens if who you report to on Twitter or wherever is thousands and thousands of peer reviewers, and what happens when the norms of either our society's attitudes towards what you're posting or free expression in general changes. And
So, Chris, if I may, since you're the one who's wearing the Snapchat glasses, surveillance must be close to your thought process. How would you respond to that?
So I think that sort of the questioner sort of hit right on it, which is that the consequences of surveillance depend entirely on the standards of the society in which you live. So the easiest example at hand is, it's just been revealed. I mean, people have been talking about this for a while, but apparently in China, as I understand it, there's something like the government is working on something like a credit score that sort of evaluates your worth as a human being, and it includes everything from do you, pay back your loans to filial piety, and this can determine your access to all kinds of resources. So that's literally a Black Mirror episode. It's the nightmare scenario for the Facebook-powered surveillance state that we've been building forever. So we have this incredible power we have more power than ever to realize George Orwell's 1984, and it's entirely up to us and our civic institutions whether we do that. It is a little bit frightening that we continue, the sort of arc of human history is that we just keep making more powerful tools that can potentially be deployed by fewer and fewer people. Nuclear weapons weren't the end of that. I was joking with somebody before this talk that now is a good time to rewatch the Will Smith movie was it Enemy of the State?
Yeah,
The one that
yeah.
seemed so paranoid when it came out,
Right.
because none of that technology was mainstream. And now it just seems like just utterly plausible. So I think it's a question where technology, has a role as like an instrument, but like more than ever, I gotta be honest, like more than ever as a technology journalist, I feel like I live in a time when I every week when I sit down and with an editor, I'm like, what are we gonna talk about? I want to go outside of technology because like there's so many other things that are like determining how we use it as a tool. Like I'm not a technological. There are people in Silicon Valley who are just straight up technological determinists. If you build surveillance, it's going to get used, or it's going to lead to this, or it's going to lead to my libertarian utopia. If only you get your laws out of me, out of my way. And I just don't think that's ever the case. And there's tons of other countries like China where there's the same sets of technology and they get used in totally different ways.
Yeah, did you have a question?
Yeah, just to follow up on that. We talked about the surveillance state, and we talked about the ubiquity of digital information in our lives, but we haven't really talked much about authoritarianism, which is except in the last 30 seconds there when Chris was talking about China. But there's a good possibility that we will be welcoming in a new regime that has a strong authoritarian streak. And I read the other day that the president has unfettered access, for example, to universal text messaging.
Only in an emergency.
Only in an emergency, but guess who gets to decide whether something is an emergency or not? So get ready for the 3 a.m. Phone call. It'll be a text on your
Amber Alert.
an Amber Alert about the latest CNN outrage or whatever. So I guess what I'm asking is, it seems like we've done a lot of thinking about surveillance, but we have not done a lot of thinking about power, especially governmental power. And are people thinking about that now? And what are the implications when you combine 1930s style authoritarianism with 2016 style networked media?
The place that I like to start is Fred Turner's book, The Democratic Surround. If you haven't read it, I really recommend it. It documents how in the 1930s, the U.S. was panicking over the rise of film because they saw film as a fascist technology coming from Europe and bringing with it a whole set of values that were deeply destructive to American democratic structures. And what was interesting is the U.S. Information Agency brought together, the original Department of Defense version of it, brought together the best intellectuals of the era. Margaret Mead and Gregory Bateson, John Cage, the founders of MoMA, and said, imagine what democratic media should look like. And they did, and basically they built the architectures that would become ARPANET, by the way. But in the process, they also built a new way of trying to think about how to propagate American democratic values. And in the 1950s, we rolled this out, and Fred does a phenomenal job of laying out this history, things like the family of man and all of these artistic things that basically became American-style Cold War propaganda. And we resisted it later on. And in fact, that's a lot of what happens in the 70s. And the interesting thing that he argues is that the 60s ended up having a much more authoritarian frame to it than people actually realized because of some of what was going on in these times. And so one of the things I think is important to remember is that American culture rises and falls in authoritarian relationships, resisting it, embracing it, trying to figure out new ways, and technology does as well. I think that no matter what we see in the next couple of years, we will see these connections of using data for ways that some people like and some people don't. And collections of open data that were thought to be a good idea at the time, collections of insecure data that were thought to be unproblematic, collections of every undocumented person who was raised in this country, may prove to be deeply destructive. And I think you're right, it's about power. And the question is, who is in power and how do we understand power? But we also have to attend to the fact that most people in this country feel as though the folks in this room are in power in a way that they are not.
Okay.
And I think we've got to deal with that complexity at a local and civic
I am
level.
in power. And I want to give you the last word. Oh, Chris, just to wrap this up on that point. So is this our moment?
I mean, I think as in every age, like, we're going to find out just how destructive potentially are the technologies that we have created, is the short answer. And it, you know, like, history is always finding new ways to be both wonderful and utterly terrible. And unfortunately, we shouldn't imagine that this age is going to be any different. So it's a really interesting time to be a young journalist, I'd say.
And to a room full of young journalists and vintage anthropologists and fair to middling technology columnists, I want to say thank you very, very much. And those of you online, not just for, I think, an unusually thoughtful and stimulating conversation, but for what I think all of us are carrying forward from this. It is on us. Thank you.